Good morning, everybody, and thank you for having us here today. Today we're going to talk about our research paper that we've written called Who is the Science Occupier? We're going to discuss the key findings from this research. The organisations and the people who co-wrote this paper are experts in the sector and have spent the last 20, 30, if not more, years building science-related schemes. The authors of this paper, the agenda for today also irons Suzanne Housen. We're going to go through the presentation and then have a panel discussion and questions at the end. The authors of the paper and joining me today are Eugene Sayers, partner at Sheppard Robson, leading the science and technology sector. Give a wave. Lyndon Spencer Allen, director responsible for science in the UK at Ramboll. John Steele, associate director and science research sector lead for London South East at Hoare Lea. Rob Berbera, partner at 3PM, responsible for science and technology. And Nick Sandy, director of T&T, working exclusively for the science sector for the last 10 years. We also have Orestes Sortsoglu from Biomed Realty, who we interviewed as part of this paper, joining us on video, hopefully, later. Right, so I'm going to have a go and talk about everybody's organisations quickly to give you a bit of an introduction. So Rob and I are from 3PM, we are project managers. We are turning 10 years old. We spent the last 10 years and more building science-related schemes. We've worked with a whole range of clients across the science sectors, and here's a few examples of some of the science parks that we've been involved with. Right, Sheppard Robson, they are 80 years old and they have a real breadth and depth of science experience, the variety of science along with a whole range of other sectors, and they have specialisms in all of these sectors. Hammersmith 245 is a great example of where the findings of this research have been applied. They are also taking those learnings and using their architectural skills to work with other commercial developers such as Bruntwood. Hoare Lea are the largest MEP-only consultancy and market leaders in workplace and science and research. They are working across HE, commercial and science developers, and also with science tenants, and it gives them a unique, holistic view of the market MEP provisions. Ramboll are 16,000 people across the globe, covering all sectors, but they have specialisms in the UK in science and commercial spaces, and are the go-to structural vibration and acoustic engineers in this sector. An example of where the research paper's findings are being put into effect in Cambridge Biomedical Campus and Granter Park with Biomed Realty, who we're fortunate we're going to hear from later. How am I doing with your companies? Tenant and Townsend are 75 years old this year and deliver a variety of services across the breadth and the real estate sector. They are leaders in the science sector, having delivered major projects such as the Francis Crick Institute in London. They have a deep understanding of the science sector built up over many years. Good. Right, I'm going to hand over to Rob to talk about our research paper.
Thank you, Susanna. I have some notes here, so forgive me. Just check my I get the message across properly. So, introduction. So I'm going to do the scene setting for today, and the guys who are the experts are going to talk about the specific disciplines that they relate to. Next slide. So, forgive me if you know some of this, but I thought it'd be useful to set some context as to why the UK is such an important part for science and tech, and why it's becoming more of an emerging thing in the UK. There are centres of excellence and hubs across the world, but as you can see, I know we focus on the Golden Triangle here, but this is broader than that, and I'll go on to about what the UK has to offer on the next slide. But we are ideally placed because of the knowledge that transfers across from the US. So there are more biotechs and startups in San Francisco and Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Boston, and all the way down the East Coast. A lot of that learning is coming across into the UK, and how they launch their companies on the NASDAQ, and how investment is attracted in there, and how they understand the companies that we are trying to attract as developers, investors, and for occupiers. And then obviously, because of where the UK is centred around the Greenwich Meridian, it's perfect for time zones as well to reach both east and west. So it ticks a number of boxes for the global science community. So it's important that we have these hubs for scaling great ideas, nurturing top talent and building a density pool of expertise that actually is sustainable. And that all leads to build a community that's perfect for occupiers in the UK. Next slide. So what we set out here is, on the right-hand side is an extract from a previous research paper we did on science parks and business parks. And what we have shown here is the heat map of where accelerator incubator spaces are predominantly located in hubs around the UK: Liverpool, Manchester, Newcastle, Edinburgh, obviously Cambridge, Oxford. Stevenage isn't on there at the moment, but is becoming a growing expertise area for something called advanced therapeutic medicinal products. That's a very long-winded way of saying cell and gene therapy. So it's becoming a bit of a centre of excellence for Europe, and that will actually start to emerge more, and those that are working with us in that area will see that growth. Cambridge and Oxford, well established, lots of talent, lots of opportunity for occupiers. And then London is always going to be a really significant place for repurposing of real estate and repurposing it in the right way for not only to provide flexibility but adaptability for the future. So we can talk about that a little bit later. And then on the left here we've shown how those all interact. So this is in the research paper, but it talks about how private science parks, public science, government intervention, and then the emerging themes around, how regulators, healthcare providers, clinicians all act in this ecosystem to provide, the opportunity for new companies, but also to give start-up biotechs coming out of academia the opportunity to kind of take on their own real estate and then grow. They grow very quickly and quicker than the real estate can keep up with. So the idea for all of us here is to second guess what that growth would look like, how we can be adapting existing buildings and how we can provide that space for them in the future. Next slide. So, very busy graphic here, but this just gives you a very quick snapshot of what the asset class looks like in the UK. So, just taking the top line items, it is an asset class now in its own right. We believe there's so much investment coming in that actually it does stand on its own, and it forms lots of different branches. So what we've looked at and what we've done as working in this field for hundreds of combined years, both in companies and individuals and also in expertise, we're able to map out what that looks like today. This is not exhaustive, but this is the kind of companies that are in the UK at the moment that are growing and emerging. And these provide opportunities for developers, investors to repurpose their real estate. Government play a key role. They act as a catalyst. They invest money in policy level. And then the biotechs, the biopharmas, the pharmaceuticals all use that to actually grow their own pipelines, spin off new companies within their own organisations, or found their own companies coming out of academia. And on the far side, which is an interesting change over the last 5-6 years, you're seeing new investment coming in from people that actually have never been in this space before. So what this research paper aims to do is not provide a panacea, but actually a roadmap for asking the right questions to the right people at the right time. It's moved so fast. This is kind of out of date almost now, and we've only just finished it. So it's going to continue to emerge. Next slide, please. So what does this paper look to answer from a technical perspective? Well, we've put down a simple science journey here, which some will be familiar with, some won't be. Taking it from bioinformatics, computational work, right the way through R&D, which everybody will hear about, into process development, into translational. That's the translational piece is where it goes into clinical work, and there's a heavy reliance all the way through those 4 phases with working with the NHS, clinicians, just really to target your therapeutics. That's the kind of work all of these science organisations are doing now, which is why they need very similar space to work in the same environments. Manufacturing medical devices is highly specialised, highly complex, very bespoke, and is really at the end of their journey. But interestingly, a lot of companies that start as, for example, biotechs, which is kind of ideal for real estate repurposing, actually start all of these elements virtually at the same time because they all have different migration timelines. So to build a manufacturing facility, you have to take a really big leap of faith, a lot of investment money, NASDAQ floated, and then move on with that development. This research paper looks at the commercial tenant sweet spot. Really, these are the type of areas where the property that we're looking at can provide, that opportunity. Next slide. And then just to finish up, on the left, this graphic is courtesy of Hoare Lea, our colleagues, but just a shout out to them. This is what it used to be: large institutions, lots of money pumped into them, government funded generally, absolutely vital for national infrastructure because that is, offers free science to the community. Where we're now going is bespoke commercial science. Places like Oxford Science Park, Beckbrook, Achilles Arena, 245 Hammersmith, some great buildings there, and those are symptomatic of what we'll be doing, in the future. All of us will be working on going forward. So we have some great talent, and that's kind of where we're heading.
Yeah. We're going to do a double act. Yeah. So yeah, we're just going to talk a bit about design considerations and things that the tenants may require, and how it could fit into any existing building or new building. So I think first of all, it's probably good to take a step back and just look at what the specification level that the tenant would require could be. There are three main drivers really that could influence this. So first of all, the typology of science. I think Rob articulated there are many different typologies, medtech, cell and gene therapy, etc. They all have different needs, and depending on the location, where they are in the city. So for example, if you're in a city centre, it's more likely to be an incubator next to a higher education facility that they lean on. And then also we need to look at what the maturity of said occupier would be. So if you're a spin-out, you're likely to be looking at higher specification of the laboratory in terms of the fit-out, so you'd have almost a fully functioning lab at day one. And then if you're more of a scale-up, so you've secured additional funding, that would lend itself to more of a shell and core kind of approach to fit-out, basically, because they're much more bespoke in their requirements. Then generally the common themes for occupiers are that they need innovation and also looking at what the local ecosystem is so that they can attract and retain staff. So that's really picking up on what Orestes was saying in the video, in case you didn't catch it, is that the drivers for innovation, is, the collaboration between organisations is sort of absolutely critical. So making that, building that into your property is really important. And then generally, there's a whole ream of different types of science. We won't list them, but obviously there's going to be office write-up, lighter CL2 wet lab, biology typically, so not too many fume cupboards or MBSCs. And then you've got a higher level which would be more chemistry-based tenants or occupiers where you have higher intensity, maybe higher air change rates and higher density of equipment. And then at the end there's advanced manufacturing, which is kind of further along the spectrum of their development. And in a way, this is a sort of pictorial representation of Rob's sweet spot slide. So most of what we've considered in our paper is the stuff in the middle, and not the picture at the far end, which is probably too onerous for your kind of average inner city building. And in the first slide, we picked up on some of the kind of key themes that we're meeting in designing buildings for science users. And another, apart from interaction and the kind of drive for innovation, another sort of common theme is flexibility and adaptability. And I think it's almost kind of ubiquitous. If you're talking about science buildings, people talk about how you're going to flex the building. And there are three drivers that we've picked out there on the slide. But the reality is that the companies that we're providing for, so Rob and John have both talked about spin out and scale up.
they're very often young companies. They're taking small amounts of space, and they're changing quite rapidly. They want to grow. Occasionally, they're required and need to move, or they might even fail. So, unlike a sort of classic office development, there's a significant percentage of space that needs to flex to allow companies to ebb and flow. There's another kind of part to this, which is the kind of desire to create an ecosystem. So you might have a building that has all sorts of companies. So we talked about the life cycle, and companies, big pharmaceutical companies, very often will want to be in proximity to small innovative companies, and vice versa, so they can share either big equipment or big ideas. So there's a need to create in your buildings this kind of ecosystem, and also an ecosystem that interacts with other buildings around that. And then, of course, there's technological change. So if you look at the buildings that we designed 10 years ago, the kind of spaces we're providing for science now are not identical to those we provided 10 years ago. There's been big movements in automation and robotics, and so some of the processes that used to be done by hand are now carried out by machines. And that's just one instance of changes the physical shape of the laboratory space. So Lyndon's kindly allowed me to talk about structures, and if we're talking about flexibility, the one thing that's really hard to change is the structure in a building, the primary structure. So obviously, if you're building from scratch, you've got a chance to get that right. And the drivers from the kind of scientific market are that, generally speaking, the load capacity of the building has to be higher for a laboratory space than for an office space. Now, in the report or the paper, you'll see we've kind of tried to identify sort of sweet spots about that. But broadly speaking, they're heavier duty buildings. Scientific equipment is quite sensitive to vibration. Not all scientific equipment and not all the disciplines equally, but it's a tendency. So if you're designing generic spaces for occupiers to be confirmed, you'll need to take that into account. And then services distributions are really important part of enabling science space. So the solutions of these things tend to be concrete structures. If you're building a new build, we tend to go for flat soffits, and there's a structural bay conversation that we usually have to have. Laboratories are not planned to a 1.5 metre grid, so there's usually a conversation about whether it's more efficient to plan your building as an office on a 1.5 metre grid and accept inefficient labs, or whether it's better to plan it for labs and accept inefficient offices. So there's discussions there. And then last of all, embodied carbon, it's very difficult because laboratories are quite demanding and the performance is not always negotiable. There's a discussion to be had. And so, having said the concrete structure is a good thing, you always have to kind of take into account embodied carbon. And of course, refurbishment is part of that discussion. A lot of the buildings that we're going to be fitting out are not purpose-built. They're not new builds, first of all, and they may not even have been built for very modern offices. So there are lots of remedial solutions that can be considered. Next slide. So as a kind of follow-up from that, having talked about the structural frame and talked about the space planning grid, the other conversation that we often have at the beginning of design for a science building is what's the right floor to floor height, and the driver for that is usually the M&E, because they want to distribute air across the ceiling, what was the ceiling void, or is the ceiling void. And you can see we've sort of cartooned it out there on the left, and you can imagine that slide sat next to a typical office. So you're talking about a much greater sort of depth of ceiling void. We've kind of exaggerated that for effect. Some laboratories actually have a whole floor of plant space above them, which we call an interstitial floor. And again, for the purposes of this exercise, we're not really engaging with those sort of specialist labs. But what you can see on the right is a project that's built, that was designed in a building that was designed for offices. So you can see what is possible. And what we did there was we've omitted the ceiling, which is why I used the photo, because you can see the M&E flying over the top, so it's apparent. And so you can, it is a negotiable thing. There are tricks you can play, and there isn't a hard line that this is the right answer. Next slide. So having talked about air, I'm going to pass to John.
Thanks, Eugene. So as part of the M&E, there are additional air change rates required within labs in comparison to offices. This is an example of 245 Hammersmith Road, where designed as an office, BCO office, laboratory went into the space. In order to make the labs work, we actually placed on-floor air handling units within the floor plate, and this negated any need for air handling units to go on the roof where space was at a premium. What it meant as well was that the occupier, had full autonomy over their plant, so they didn't have to traipse up to the roof, and actually it worked quite well. We had to add additional louvers to get the additional air onto the facade, but yeah, it's quite a simple solution to meeting the needs of the occupier. If you're talking about a new build, then the additional air change rates would be obviously built into the air handling units and distribution ductwork.
It's worth just saying that, for a laboratory, typically you're talking about 6 air changes an hour as a minimum, and that obviously that can grow compared to how many for an office.
Well, I think in commercial science we're trying to challenge the norm. So traditionally, I think HE and government air change rates were quite high to what they are now. So I think to get that real efficiency and value for money for our landlords and occupiers, then by driving that down, it also helps with the operational carbon as well. So we're looking at more 3 to 6, depending on what the typology of science is. But as part of that briefing process, I think it's integral to just really challenge their requirements, because the higher air change rates generally emanate from the processes that are in the lab. So if you really get to grips with what the processes are within the labs, you can justifiably reduce the air change rate. So the other element is fume extract. So I think there are basically 2 ways you could possibly go about it: the traditional CFD analysis and a flue as depicted on the slide at the bottom. But actually, again, I think it's all about challenging the norm. I think ducted fume cupboards, you can challenge it. So for example, at 245 Hammersmith Road, it would have been very challenging given the environment and the turbulent airflow around that Hammersmith roundabout to actually put a flue up there. So we got to grips with the users, got a list of chemicals, and actually looked at whether we could put in recirculating fume cupboards, which negates the need for any flues, and actually we proved that it could work, and as such it was much more simple installation, didn't have to go through planning, etc. So although flues can look scary, there are ways around it, basically. We're trying to make things simple, I think is the message here. And then there's obviously a requirement in labs, back of house, so handling of consumables, solids and solvents and acids, gases and cryogenics, so cryogenics being liquid nitrogen typically used for cell storage on the floor. So I don't want to go into too much detail, but liquid nitrogen, if you're transporting it around the building, you need certain health and safety requirements. There are ways around that as well by potentially using liquid nitrogen generators, which negate the need for as extensive health and safety requirements. So again, it's a challenge, but it's absolutely not unovercomable.
So it's one of the key differentiators between a science occupier and a non-science occupier is you do have to provide these spaces, and you have to envisage how they might, flex and change as your occupier profile changes.
So another key aspect is what the landlord-occupier split should be, and this is right for fit out or new build. So I think, as we alluded to earlier, the maturity of the tenant could dictate what your day one specification of the laboratory would be. This depicts a more of a scale-up, more mature tenant where you'd probably, in theory, go with more of a shell and core type approach because they've got more specific requirements in the lab and probably the funding as well that they can do the fit out themselves, rather than if you're an incubator spin out type occupier, you'd require something a bit more fitted out, oven ready, so that you can go in and start exacting your science.
So it's worth saying we've already written Cat A at the top, and thanks to the BCO, that those concepts being there kind of well understood. In the laboratory world, that doesn't really exist, so it's still something that's negotiated very much on an individual basis, so it's something that needs to be considered and discussed.
So in terms of net zero carbon sustainability, it's obviously increasingly important, extremely important for both occupiers and their funders as well, with particular requirements. I'd say laboratories are much more energy intensive, we know that, and there are health and safety considerations in terms of air change rates, etc., etc. But what we would say is there's huge opportunity here to make big gains. So demand-led ventilation, if you implement some of these, then you can actually get quite big operational savings. And then obviously smart sockets, lower light levels, control capacity. I think really it goes down to that initial briefing with the occupier. You can challenge them against the norm of what they may have done before. You can drive down that operational carbon.
We're going to touch on two sort of project examples which illustrate some of the things that we've all said. And this is a project which is on the Cambridge Biomedical Campus, and actually we didn't work on it, so it's a building designed by MBBJ architects and with Ramboll and Hoare Lea structural engineer and services engineers. But what makes it quite interesting is it's a building where they've separated out the offices and the laboratories. So it's a single occupier, it's commercially rented space, but because they had the occupier there at the beginning and taking the whole building, they were able to pull those two bits of brief apart. And what it does is it illustrates the kind of really clearly the difference between an office building and a laboratory building. So you can see on the left the green block, which is planned to a 6.6 metre grid. It has a much greater floor-to-floor height. 4.5 metres, and then you can see on the right the blue block, which is all the office accommodation, and that's planned on a 1.5 metre module, so 7.5 metre structural grid, and it has a lower floor-to-floor height. They both have rooftop plants, and there's a little bit of extra flexibility for laboratory, but broadly speaking, that kind of difference between office and laboratory is set in stone, inverted commas, in the building. So it illustrates nicely what the gap in kind of in the building architecture is. And I think if you go on to the next slides, you can see that from the outside it's a sort of handsome building, but then actually if you go on to the next slide again, you can see here the jump in the floor-to-floor heights between the two buildings. So by splitting those two, the advantage of that is by splitting the labs from the offices, you make you reduce the kind of high energy, high kind of structural cost laboratory space to only the minimum necessary. You can build a much lighter weight office building next door to it. I suppose the disadvantage might be in the future is that your lab space is capped effectively, so you can't have the lab migrate into the office. So you've really put a limit on your future lab space, and of course you can see that you have to deal with those differential floor-to-floor heights, so you might have to have double-sided lifts and perhaps extra circulation, but it makes for a really attractive kind of building as an architect. It's the kind of thing we really enjoy. And then there's a sort of contrast to that. If we go to the next slide, we've talked about this project already. This is 245 Hammersmith Road, and it's a project that we designed with Hoare Lea's and the engineers. It was actually designed as a commercial office, and then what we found is that the first tenants have been basically science-based companies, and so some of the decisions that we made earlier in the design have actually made that science conversion possible. So I think the first one is the fact that it's a concrete structure, so there's a robustness there. Through good fortune and obviously great design, we chose a flat soffit. So again, one of those things that enables easy coordination of services. And it's a relatively loose fit. It had a 4 metre floor-to-floor height. So again, you've got that kind of extra room, so a looser fit. And what that means is that you can pretty much put anything you want anywhere. So if we zip through the next few slides, I mean, this is really just to show we planned it out as an office. With your kind of classic open plan open plan desk seatings and a variety of work settings for what we envisage will be a media company. And if we go to the next plan, so this is how, as a sort of shell and core architect, we dealt with the possibility of labs. So the things that really helped were having a goods lift that could be accessed separately, having a circulation route that allowed for service access to the laboratory spaces from the back that didn't go through your front of house. So segregated circulation is really, really important and desirable. And of course having space that we could carve out for M&E. So the facade, having demountable, we could demount panels in the facade and add louvers in, which meant we could create on-floor part, which meant we didn't have to drive risers up to the 10th floor. So there's a few things that we did in there that you could reproduce. So we learned quite a lot through this exercise. And then if we hand over to Nick.
Morning everybody, Nick Sandy from Tenant and Townsend. So just today what I want to talk through with you briefly, just skip a little bit quick on that first slide, but just want to talk about some of the key cost drivers around these sorts of facilities. The guys obviously touched on some of those from a cost perspective, what's going to drive cost into these facilities. Then we'll go on to some elemental cost benchmark ranges, which we've done for refurbishment and for new build. I think you've probably got a flavour from what the guys have been saying that there's a range of cost for these facilities because of the type of science that could be done, the type of occupiers and the type of tenants. Following that, we'll go on to a couple of, or one cost model, so an example of a cost model that's included within the research paper. There's 3 within the research paper, so I urge you to have a look at those separately. We'll just give you a quick example of one of those. And then finally, just to end, touching on, if you're looking at refurbishing existing building stock, what are some of the key things to think about that might impact cost? And when if developers are looking at their stock and their buildings, what features should they look for? So this slide here, just picking up on some of the items that the guys have already mentioned. So there's implications from a cost point of view across all the design disciplines. And in terms of MEP, you've got your typical systems that you'd expect within an office, but then you've got to potentially upgrade those and add new systems as well that you wouldn't typically have. We touched on, the guys touched on sort of frame type and the frame solution. So that's one that should be looked at really, really early, likely to be a concrete solution, more likely due to the vibration. But you can also look at the extent of that, or the extent of that building to cater for sensitive vibration across the building floor plate. So that might mean you're beefing up your floor slabs, which obviously would increase cost, but it's understanding who those tenants may be at an early stage. In terms of sort of additional MEP systems, so you've got things like separate piped lab gases potentially, if that's what the tenants need, or there's other options as well in terms of taking it up through dedicated lifts and so forth. But again, depending on what the need is, it's going to drive additional cost into the scheme. But there are ways around it, and as the guys were touching on, trying to challenge some of those options and go for cost-effective routes. If you could skip on to the next slide, please. So let's stand back a bit. So this slide here, what we try to do in the research, there's more context around this, is a couple of elemental benchmarking ranges. So we've stripped out things like prelims and overhead and other on costs, but we've included on the left-hand side a refurbishment range for the different elements, and then on the right-hand side a new build. So it's just highlighting really that at each element there's going to be a range of cost, because depending on what you're trying to achieve, whether that be your floor to ceiling heights are fairly modest, in which case on a new build, potentially, therefore your external wall cost you could drive down. But actually, if you're going for more flexibility, a bigger floor to ceiling, then you're going to drive external wall cost up potentially. But there's a lot more context in the research on this, so it's just making that point really that there is a range across the different elements. If we can skip on to the next slide. So this is one of the cost models included in the research. It's the refurbishment up to sort of CL2 wet lab. So there's quite a heavy intervention here in terms of the existing building and what this model includes. So it's got structural modifications to it to support the building in terms of dealing with the need, full strip out of the plant and services and replacement, and hygienic finishes throughout as well. So there's two other scenarios in the report. One is another refurbishment with a lighter touch sort of intervention. One is for a new build, so please do look at those. If we can skip on, please. Oh, there's the scenario that it is. And then just to sum up, really. So if one of your clients or developers looking at the buildings that they have in their portfolio, and how might you look at those and understand them as to whether or not they will work to be fit to a lab use or be appropriate for science occupiers. So structural grid we've talked about. Look at the structural grid, understand what those buildings currently have, and then think about that trade-off between what labs require and the typical 1.5 metre grid. Suitability of frame, reinforced concrete. Look at that. Slab to slab heights. We've touched on this, so 3.7 minimum, really, up to sort of a preferred of 4.2. It can even be higher potentially. Riser space, I haven't really touched on that yet, but riser space will increase because of the requirements for infrastructure running up the building to support the lab spaces, whether that be the pipe gases or extra ventilation needs. So riser space is key. So if you've got buildings that have bigger riser capacity in them or spare riser capacity, then they might be good options to look at. Logistics and back of house. Science occupiers need that space. They need back of house areas. They need storage more so than a typical office. Lift provision. So we've touched on sort of dedicated lift provision potentially because of liquid nitrogen. If you're taking up gases because of health and safety, so there's sometimes a need for an extra lift to go in. Foul and laboratory drainage. So just there might need to be dedicated drainage going in to support the lab as well, so the ability to be able to retrofit that then easily is another consideration. And then finally, ventilation and fume extract. John touched on the option that fume cupboards, if you look at recirc and things like that, that have an awareness that there will need to be extra ventilation potentially required and whatnot to support those types of spaces. That was a bit of a whistle-stop tour for me in terms of the cost element, but thanks very much for listening to us all, and I'll hand back to Susanna.
Okay, thank you. That was brilliant. Obviously, there's a lot more information in the report, so I urge you to. I think it's live now on the website, so you can download it and learn more about what we've been discussing. Right. So I have an iPad. But apparently, if you get to this, you can ask some questions, and it works for people online as well. And just whilst you're all thinking about questions you want to ask, I'm going to ask Lyndon a question. So in the presentation, we heard about all the sort of structural drivers. Can you just expand a little bit on the solutions for this for sites?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Good morning, everyone. So the guys touched on a few of these points, but I really want to talk about vibration, number one, and I'll just touch on loading and some of the others, perhaps you can ask some questions on if you're interested. But for vibration, I think there's three types of space that need to be considered. One is the write-up and office space, which really is no different to a normal office, so that doesn't drive things. On the other hand, you've got specialist equipment, so this is things that are very sensitive to vibration. Not all science occupiers have that, so it might be electron microscopes, these things. They need special consideration. Not to say they can't be on upper floors, typically they're on the ground floor, but as I said, not all occupiers have that. What that leaves us with is the general lab space, and this is where I think we all end up having a lot of thoughts about, and what is the requirement? And that's really driven by two things. One, the fact that scientists often do precise work, and they have to not be affected by the vibration whilst doing that work. And the other is equipment that is vibration sensitive, but has to be close to where those scientists are operating. Now, in a new building, what we can do is optimise the structural frame to actually give a level of vibration that typically is just below the level of human perception. So people can't feel it, which gives precise work capability, but also gives the opportunity for a lot of that sense of equipment to work. And if it's more sensitive, then you can use a local vibration isolation approach. But of course, what happens when you're refitting a space that perhaps wasn't designed for labs and has a higher vibration performance? I think this is really where the sort of question of time really is about actually how do you approach that? And I think it's really about zoning and probably getting some vibration surveys done of the existing facility, because often you find naturally areas of floor styles will achieve better than others. If you can zone your labs into those spaces, that really gives you an opportunity. Maybe also with a bit of stiffening as well. By doing that, actually, you can challenge the fact that you need the flexibility across the whole floor plate in the existing facility. I think there's another thing just to touch on is there's an emerging technology which can be really interesting in this space, which is active damping technology, boxes that you install on the soffit of a floor slab, which will act a bit like noise cancelling headphones, and actually they can get vibration levels down from what might be typical office space down to more akin to laboratory space. They're quite expensive at the moment, technology will develop, but that's a really interesting thing to look out for in the coming years. Just touch on loadings very, very quickly. Obviously, new build, you can allow that slightly higher level. If it's a refit, then you've got that question, well, if it's BCO office loading spec, the lab spec for the imposed loading is slightly higher. You can challenge that though, because actually often that's to do with certain types of equipment, and perhaps you can actually look at the operational constraints around that equipment and say, well, in order to open that freezer, you have to have a space in front, and perhaps you can then get that argument down to say there's a you can get down to the base loading. The superimposed dead loading, we call it, so that's the weight that's there that isn't part of the imposed loading or the structure, is actually something really important to consider, and that is that most offices will have a raised access floor. Laboratories with vibration have a challenge with that because the raised access floor can make the vibration worse. So sometimes we end up having to fill that void. That obviously adds weight. How do you achieve that within the loading constraints? And again, that might be a zoning approach, or have some aspects where you keep the raised access floor and make sure you seal it properly, because they're not always conducive. So there's definitely ways to solve these issues. New builds are easier than the existing buildings, but there's approaches that can be used.
You've actually managed to answer some of the questions that were coming in about structure in that, so well done. Right. There's a question here about how much has the base specification for labs changed in the last 5 years, and how much could it change in the next 5 years? Whoever would like to answer.
It's a cost one, isn't it? It's got to be Nick, isn't it?
It's not a base specification, it's more of a spec.
I mean, I think just on an MEP perspective, I think we mentioned earlier that we're moving more from a HE traditional, probably higher air change rate, more energy intensive, into more of a commercial realm, where if we're acting for an occupier or a landlord or a science development, for example, we're really being challenged to push down that specification to that sweet spot where it's good value for them and good value also when looking at net zero carbon, volume carbon. You don't want to over-design things basically. So I think from an M&E perspective, it's being driven down slightly. Obviously, that is dependent on the type of science that's going in there, and obviously location and maturity of said occupier.
Okay, great.
Yeah, from an architectural point of view, it's probably the increase in the amount of equipment that we're accommodating. So the driver for the layout is very often not just the bench, which at once, you know, a bench-based kind of lab isn't the big part of it anymore. Well, it still is a big part, but it's not quite as dominant.
Okay, thank you. Just to say that there is a roaming mic if anybody wants to ask the question on the floor rather than using Slido. Just ask another one then. So, life science is a very topical discussion at the moment. Has there been an increase in tenant requirements or a desire to provide for the existing requirements? So, are there more tenants that need space, and that's why there's a boom, or is it that people are just providing that space? Go on then.
So I think there is an increase in demand because it's the ability to start and scale a company is becoming easier, mainly as a result of convergence of technology, of science, of available space. There is a undersupply issue at the moment, but the danger is everyone races after the ball and ends up providing too much of the wrong kind of space, and then you end up with a problem when you've got an oversupply and the demand isn't there to meet it. So the real thing to do now is to think about the next step of science. So what's that going to be like in the future? And digital is going to be a massive part of that. So we're going to be able to do things, we already are doing things in science that we couldn't do 5 years ago, and it's only going to increase, it's going to converge. So that will change what the real estate offer looks like. Especially when you've now got a mixed mode, hybrid, whatever you want to call it, working pattern as well. You still need labs, but labs are going to be multifunctional as well now. And the key thing to meet the supply-demand equation, I think, is to make sure that your day one use is not necessarily what you're going to need next week or the week after, and you've got to look at setting your parameters as to what the building can provide in its maximum ability, which is what identify the sweet spot, and then offer and add on as you need, as the occupiers need to change. Because what we see a lot of is there's a lot of people asking for space, but what people don't seem to kind of understand is when they say we're going to grow quickly, there's a bit of are you really going to? And actually we've seen with a lot of the biotechs in particular, the thing that's holding them back now is talent and skills rather than the science and the ability to grow in footprint. So that's what's holding them back at the moment. Technology's being evolved to allow them to do that, so actually the technology is helping with the talent resource equation, but they still need more and more people, and so there's it's the same in every walk of life at the moment, but skilled scientists, skilled academics, skilled clinicians is really where the problem is, and that actually is a real estate problem because that is actually driving the amount of space they need. We're working with a company that started 5 years ago with 4 people, and next year will be 350. So it's really quick. So everyone's going, well, you can't just build new space to accommodate 350 people, so you've got to be really agile in how you work with what you've got at the moment. And the key word for me really is adaptable. I know flexible is like what you give on as a professional team, but how do you adapt it quickly? That's the one that's really going to set people apart and actually adapt it for things that they might not know they need now. And just go with them on the whole journey, really understand their business. That's the key one. Sorry, that was a bit of a long answer.
That's great, thank you. There's one from Francis Brown. At the briefing stages for new commercial developments, how do we decide how much emphasis a particular development should have on enabling life sciences? We love that word. Do you want to read it again? At the briefing stages for new commercial developments, how do we decide how much emphasis a particular development should have on enabling life sciences?
Right.
Yeah.
I think this,
Yeah.
with some help with my colleagues actually. I think, first of all, I think you need to step back and look at the bigger picture. So if there is no science ecosystem in that area, do you need to consider enabling that to be a lab building in the future? If there is a market in the general vicinity, then it seems like a sensible idea. That's where I would come at it from.
I think there's engagement with that market as well, isn't there? If it's in a space where there clearly is a market, then upfront engagement and understanding of that local market as well, what the type of science they're doing, and getting understanding of that is really key.
Enabling comes at a price as well, which I guess is probably part of how much do you build into the infrastructure to enable you to do something with it in the future that you might not need to do from day one. So the things that suck the money in an investment decision for builders and developers and investors is how much back a house, how appropriate is the back of a house, where do I spend all the money and the footprint, how do I deal with on-floor plant, does that take space, how do I deal with the main plant, how do I scale it up, all of that costs money that maybe you don't need on day one. So that's
So yeah, what's the premium on rental income?
Right.
Above, say, a commercial, why would you do it?
Well, that's not necessarily a premium on rental income, right? Because a lot of people, what we're seeing is you would get really good rents on a commercial building in the city that might be between 80 and 140, 150 pound a foot, right? But really nice, premium space. Science isn't at that level. So you're providing much more functionality at a lower rent, but you then have to, in our view, we have to change your investment model. So you look at the longer game rather than a 3 and 5 year cycle.
Yeah.
And then look at the building, how it lives many lives in years and subsequent years, and how you repurpose quickly. And that's the adaptability question. So, you might get, in central London for sites, you might get between 70 and £100 a foot. But that's not at the top of the level of the commercial. So if people are coming from that base level, expecting 5-year returns, they're going to have to look at 10, 15 year and actually look at the occupier journey and the relationship with their business, how they grow and how they provide space to support that, so they have more stability in their returns. Does that answer it?
Yeah, it's an investment.
It's an investment decision, really. Yeah. Because if you spend that money, you've got to spend it somewhere, you've got to get it back, and you still got to make it commercially viable, right? So.
Susan, I think one of the things you can do early on is ask that what-if question. What are the potential blockers that you couldn't adapt later in that base specification? At least then that actually challenges you as a team to think early on about actually how much do I want to invest to open that, give that adaptability. And there's some things that get baked in and some you can change.
The 245 Hammersmith case is interesting, isn't it? Because it's flat slab construction, it's a 10-metre grade, very American. But the drivers and decisions then as to whether you develop an office building that was more enabled for that.
I think, it's one of the things that I was going to chip in on there was a lot of the things that make a lab possible actually make a better office anyway. So a little bit of extra floor to floor height isn't going to make a worse office. You're talking about marginal uplifts in costs, obviously, but they generally make a better building. An easier coordination, services coordination, isn't bad for an office development either. And having a nice well sort of planned space. So a lot of those things, they're not in conflict. They're actually reinforcement. So those decisions were made, I think, purely on the basis that they would be good for an office building.
245 is a really good building, actually, because you didn't have, I guess, the debate over the traditional water-floor ratios and all the things you normally go through with a commercial development. Actually, that one actually's got decent headroom to do the sweet spot science. You're not going to do high complex robotic manufacturing in there, but to be honest, you wouldn't pay premium rent for doing it in central London. You don't need to. You do it in 25 or in more different regions.
But it's very attractive to the emerging sort of small incubator spaces.
Yeah.
Small accelerating businesses that need to be located.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's where the touch points with the clinicians and the site and the other suppliers comes in, which is why in MIT and in Boston, Lab Central works really well, because they can scale whatever they need, but they can walk out the door, which is why St Pancras Knowledge Quarter is becoming really a thing, as is all the way along that kind of Euston Road, because people can literally just walk between, I can go to the hospital, I can go to they have it within arm's reach, and then if they do more expensive science, they can do it at Ebbsfleet or Discovery Park, or they can do it in the regions around Oxford and Cambridge. They're given infrastructure links to do that.
Okay.
I'll go on forever.
No, sorry, we've got lots of questions coming in. Okay, so hopefully sort of following on a little bit from that theme as well, is there an emerging lab office ratio that can be applied to the building services design for the target S&R subsector? So example, incubator tenants.
keeps working.
Yeah.
So probably about 2 years ago, I probably would have given you an answer on that one. I think we're seeing a change. So, you know, before the last couple of years, we were finding that the laboratory space was a minority because it was expensive, and therefore, you know, it tended to sort of be 30% of your net usable area on a floor plate, and because it costs so much, mainly because it costs so much, and because people had other facilities elsewhere, and so you'd have a large part of what we were offering was really workplace, and we're finding that's the ratio is pushing the other way, because obviously office space is not quite so intensely used, and also people are looking at, you know, how they make the most of a building, and it offers the flexibility. So I'd say it's almost flipped.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're seeing. We're now into, it used to be 40-60, 40 lab office. It's now minimum 50-50. It's always 60-40 now. And actually, we were doing a project with James's team at 70-30. So you've got, and people need to get their head around the correlation between occupancy numbers of people and actually real estate footprint. Because actually the occupancy numbers in a lab are lower than they would be in an office, obviously. And then hybrid working and people not always being in the office is actually helping support that changing ratios as well. In a few years' time, it will probably change back to more offices, but it's easy to change the lab into an office and the other way now. Right? So.
Okay, bit of a structural question. You mentioned rationalising the loadings and refurbishments. How do you deal with future flexibility?
In refurbishments, well, I guess if we already have an existing structure, then that's baked in. So the question is, if you're looking to challenge the occupiers' requirements perhaps for loading everywhere, and you're looking at a more zoned approach, then how do you do that? You can obviously do that with your day one occupier, but how do you do that for future? I think this probably is where actually taking an approach with the architectural team to say, well, actually, how might you fit out? What are the sort of test fits of that space, and say, well, actually, rather than maybe just dealing with that day one zoning for that occupier, actually to look at what are the sensible adjacencies for that zoning. So it might be saying, well, actually, we know that there's always going to be offices, and there's always going to be labs in this space, so maybe provide the zoning for labs in certain areas, keep the offices somewhere else to make sure you don't have to do too much on day one to allow for that flexibility. But it really is going to be a horses for courses type response.
Okay, Emily now. Considering the future tenant, how might you deal with fume discharges, dispersal in dilution, and accommodating same at roof, example heights, screening, CFD?
Yeah, I mean, I think I touched on it in the slide earlier, so there are two options. There's the CFD analysis, obviously quite a long process in modelling the fume dispersal. I think at the heart of it is challenging what the requirements are from the occupier. So getting that list of chemicals that they're using at day one, collaboration with their health and safety team, getting that particular dilution, and then looking at whether we can go into research fume covered solution. If not, then yeah, as the question asked, there's CFD analysis, there's flues that can go up on the roof. But I think the first point of call would be to challenge, because it does have an impact on cost of planning.
Where there isn't an occupier yet, it's about asking those what-if questions.
Yeah, and then I guess if you go back to square one, if you're designing a building, you need to understand whether your tenants are going to have the potential for fume covers. So you wouldn't necessarily put them in on day one if you don't know who the occupier is. Therefore, you'd leave space on the roof for fume extract fans, distribution through risers, etc. So there are quite simple solutions to it. But again, we don't want to overcomplicate things.
Intelligent challenging is where you need to know what's driving the need. So we spend a bit of time looking at policy level, who's going to regulate what's going to be provided, because that's where people come from a science perspective. They go, well, the HSE say I need to do X, Y, and Z. What actually we do is flip it and actually talk to the HSE about, well, actually, why do you need that? Where? And it's risk-based all the time. So So if you can help the occupiers understand the risk and how your building deals with that risk, actually you can make life a lot easier with the costs around, everybody will want the Rolls Royce, but not everyone needs a Rolls Royce.
I think challenges we face on that are that a lot of the spin-out, scale-up organisations that we're working with don't have that infrastructure within their organisation. They may not have appointed a health and safety individual yet, so I think it's about informed decision-making, holding their hand a bit in that early process, just to not over-design.
Okay, is there any other? Yeah. One more question. Okay, let's talk a little bit about just geography. There's a few questions here, but so over the last 18 months, have London, or let's just say inner city urban labs, been as well utilised as out of town labs with car access, and will this influence future locations? So a little bit of touch on geography.
I don't mind doing that one. If you want. So geography is absolutely critical. The geography goes with where you are in your lifestyle as well, because it's like, if you're of a younger age and you're building your career, you want to be in the city, and actually that's where a lot of the talent starts from, and actually the ability to kind of work in multiple companies and pick up multiple inputs is really crucial about urban context. The out of town is more, you've established your field of expertise, you've got your own company, you don't really want to pay the cost of actually having something in the centre. You need a space in the centre, so you actually, things like car parking and green space and where you're going to live and where children go to school, all that is a big part of why Science Park, they do have to work together. There's still a very big need for both parts, because you can't fit everything in London or Manchester or Edinburgh. So it's important to have those spaces where you can actually grow your company and still have touch points in the places where you need for your basic research. So,
is there a link to institutions or anchor tenants at specific?
Anchor institutions in science parks always works really well. So Oxford and Cambridge are classic examples of that, where it works really well. And a lot of what's happening now is a lot of the academics and the clinicians and the biotechs and the science organisations all work in co-located spaces as well. So a lot of them work, for example, at the Royal Free together. So we're seeing a lot more of that. They don't sit in their own little institutes. The Crick is a classic example. That's a collaboration of 15 different institutions now. But it was only envisaged to be 4. So it's changing.
Sorry, I'm being chased. So thank you very much, everybody. Sorry that we cut that last bit short. So I encourage everybody to download the report. It's got a lot more information in it. There is a lot of technical information that we couldn't touch on today. But yeah, I think it's very good. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, panel, for all of your expertise and sharing all that knowledge with us. It's invaluable what you know inside your heads and what you shared with us today. So thank you, everybody. Yes? Good.